Hello and welcome to Wandering with Justin. This time I'd like to share with you a visit that I recently had the good fortune to make to the Tenterfield Centenery Cottage Museum. The museum houses a great display of artefacts from the Victorian era through up until the first half of the 20th century. And through these artefacts we can glean a great deal of information about the lives that people lived in those days, and that's the journey that I'd like to take you on today. So join me as I explore some of those concepts and the ways that people lived in this area during that time period. Wealthier families in the district might have a parlour, including some musical instruments, maybe a gramophone, in later years a radio, those type of things. They could sit together as a family in this room. Mum might be sewing, somebody might be playing a piano, Dad might be reading a newspaper, and they would spend their evenings together in these spaces near the open fire to keep themselves warm. Just imagine living in the world before you have music at your fingertips, downloads. Some older folks will have had CDs, cassettes, records. Back in the day of these folks, they had to make their own music. And indeed, a lot of the things that we take for granted, they couldn't have even imagined. In the 1800s, there wasn't really much in the way of off-the-rack clothing. Families had to make their own. So many stores would sell haberdashery. They would sell all the items that you needed to make your own clothing. And then the women of the household would learn how to make dresses using patterns and sew their ornaments on. Wealthier folks would have had an array of different clothes that they could wear and use for different occasions, whereas the poor folks would have had quite simple clothes with perhaps one Sunday best that they would use to go to church or other important events. There was certainly no flat-pack furniture back in those days, and with the nearest city hundreds of miles and many days' travel on a horse, it wasn't easy to bring anything into the area, so many things were made. Made from beautiful red cedar, this one-of-a-kind cupboard was covered with kangaroo skins, and it's a unique item handcrafted by local farmer Luke Whitten for his wife. Also made of red cedar, this ballot box is a fascinating reminder that voting anonymously via a secret ballot was invented in Australia and was first adopted in South Australia and Victoria, with New South Wales adopting this method of voting in 1858. Sometimes when we look back in history, we think of people who came in the years before us as being backwards or not as advanced as we are. But the more I look into history, the more it becomes clear that these people were no fools. They were tremendous innovators, and they found ways to solve problems, and they saw so much change, including tremendous changes in technology, in society, and in the world that they lived in. And they adapted to all of it. Not only did they just survive it, they actually flourished and created this amazing world that we live in today. And we've got a lot to be thankful for their efforts and their sacrifices. Some of these early ploughs and seeding devices would have been absolute game changers to the agricultural men of their era. These innovations really opened the land up and allowed many more people to be fed with much less labour. Throughout history, the kitchen has been the heart of family life. The displays of this museum give us a fascinating insight to the changes in kitchen technology over the 100 years or so that the museum covers. Wealthier families would have had some servants on hand to tend to the fires and keep the food going and feed the family. For poorer families, all of these duties would fall back on mum, and as they got older, the children. For the pioneers, everything that they owned was precious in ways we probably don't understand now. If you break a teapot, you can't just go get another one. There was no shop to go buy them from. They had to manage. Later, as department stores opened up in regional areas such as Tenterfield and Glen Innes, people could get things more readily, but they still had to have the money to pay for it, and that wasn't always readily available either. A lot of these folks would have bartered their services with each other because they didn't have the money to pay for things. While they all practiced self-sufficiency, if one person had more of something, they would give it to someone else in exchange for something that that person would have. And so they supported each other with a real sense of community. In the latter part of the 19th century, commerce gradually grew in the area. We can only imagine how many loaves of bread must have been made in this baker's oven, and how many mothers and housewives would have been so pleased to be able to just go to the shop and buy some loaves of bread, rather than having to get up early, muck around with yeast, get the dough to rise, all of that kneading, finally get it in the oven. How much simpler is it just to go to the shop and buy a loaf? I sometimes make my own bread from scratch and cook it in a camp oven or in other similar ways, and I do these things so that I can understand. But I would hate to have to do it on a daily basis just to try to keep myself alive. And my hat certainly goes off to those people who did this and kept their families fed and healthy. Now, as part of the museum, they have a machinery shed with a great variety of machines and implements stacked inside. On the time of our visit, the volunteer told us that the shed was due to be cleaned up and some of the items were going to be auctioned off so that they could display it in a better way. So I apologise I couldn't get any great footage in this area because things really are jammed in right on top of each other. Agriculture in this area changed dramatically through the 1800s and the early 1900s. The very beginnings of agriculture were purely grazing. Crops weren't being grown except for sustenance. Then over time, a wide variety of cropping began to be introduced throughout these areas, and people grew barley, corn, oats, wheat, and a variety of vegetables, fruit trees, and many other things. In the 1880s, the rail line was pushed through the New England, and this opened up both markets to sell produce, crops, and other things, and also it allowed for many things to be brought into the district, including new machinery, implements, and all kinds of technology that previously had to be carted up the mountains on an old bullock dray. And as the agriculture began to generate wealth in the district, people began to have more money. With more money, they wanted to buy more goods and services, and so other industries were able to develop, and these towns boomed and flourished, many of them reaching their peaks in the 1920s. The footage you're seeing now was taken in the second main building of this museum complex. This was an 1860s style workers' cottage. These style of cottages were built from the 1860s through until the 1940s, and many Australian families grew up in these type of buildings. With no electricity, running water, telephone, or any other modern convenience that we take for granted in our current lives, the people in these houses had to make do as best they could. The footage of the building in the earlier part of this video was taken from a wealthy family's home, and this part of the video will give you more of an indication of how the working class Australians of the day got on in their lives. This was originally a two-room cottage made from locally pit-sawn timber. It was used by a variety of families over the years and was even a lodging house at one point. Can you imagine these 4 rooms housing up to 14 lodgers as well as the family who lived in it? Well, it happened. How? Guests actually used to sleep on the front veranda as well as in the rooms of the house. And the stories tell us that Captain Thunderbolt, the famous New England bushranger, stayed in this lodging house as well after one of his hold-ups. Talk about having famous guests in your house. Well, that is an overview of the Centenary Cottage Museum in Tenterfield. But why is it called the Centenary Cottage Museum? Well, the original building that I showed you was actually built in 1871, and it was designated as a museum in 1971. So there's your centenary. So you have a 100-year-old house, which is a history piece in itself, then being converted into a museum to contain a collection of many of the stories of the Tenterfield's origins. And what a wonderful museum it is, and well worth spending a bit of time trying to understand and get to know the past just a little bit better. That's enough for today. Thanks very much for your company. If you liked the video, please give me a like. I'll see you in the next one. Thank you so much. Bye bye.